Every human being carries within themselves a hidden double, a silent companion that does not walk in the daylight of consciousness, but moves in the depths of the psyche. This is what I call the shadow. It is the part of us we deny, repress, and exile because it does not conform to the image we wish to present to the world. Yet the paradox is that the more we reject it, the more it governs us. To master your shadow is not to destroy it, but to make it conscious. And in doing so, you master your mind, for only the integrated self can live freely and without being pulled apart by forces it does not understand. The shadow is not merely darkness. It is energy, potential, and raw truth. By confronting it, you begin the greatest psychological journey of all, the journey toward wholeness. The shadow as the hidden self is the dimension of our being that we keep concealed not only from others, but often from ourselves. It is made up of the impulses, thoughts, desires, and instincts that do not fit into the polished image we present to the world. From childhood, we learn to bury what is unacceptable in the eyes of family, society, and culture. Perhaps it is anger, perhaps it is envy, perhaps it is the raw hunger for power or recognition. We push these elements down into the unconscious, thinking that by hiding them, we are free from their influence. Yet, in reality, what is buried does not vanish, it festers. It influences our choices, our moods, and our relationships in ways we cannot easily trace. This is why Jung insisted that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. To master your shadow requires first the courage to admit it exists. Most people live in denial of this hidden self, clinging to the illusion of moral purity or perfection, but in doing so they become slaves to what they refuse to acknowledge. The shadow is not inherently evil, though it often contains qualities that we find disturbing. For example, a person who prides themselves on being gentle may bury their aggression, but that aggression does not die. It returns in moments of passive hostility, resentment, or sudden bursts of uncontrollable rage. A person who identifies with rationality may repress their vulnerability, only to find themselves haunted by feelings of emptiness or numbness. By ignoring the shadow, we create an incomplete version of ourselves, a fragmented identity that is constantly at war with itself. The more we deny, the louder the shadow knocks at the door of consciousness. Nightmares, obsessions, compulsions, and unexplained anxieties are often its way of making itself heard. The psyche seeks wholeness, and the shadow is its reminder that we are more than the mask we wear. Confronting the shadow is not easy, because it means admitting that the image we hold of ourselves is incomplete and at times false. But it is only by acknowledging this hidden part of our being that we begin to reclaim our full humanity. Think of the shadow as a mirror. It reflects back to us everything we refuse to see. To look into it is uncomfortable, but without doing so, we walk blind into life, deceiving ourselves and blaming others for what originates within. Awareness is the first step toward mastery. By bringing the shadow into consciousness, by naming it, observing it, and understanding it, we diminish its power to manipulate us in secret. The hidden self is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a part of us that longs to be recognized. When we stop running from it, we find that it holds not only our fears and flaws, but also untapped strength and authenticity. The shadow is the key to self-knowledge, and only through facing it can the mind be mastered. Projection is one of the most dangerous ways the shadow operates when left unacknowledged. What we cannot accept in ourselves, we tend to see in others. A man who represses his own envy may accuse everyone else of jealousy. A woman who cannot face her own anger may constantly feel threatened by the aggression of others. This process is largely unconscious, which is what makes it so insidious. We do not realize that we are looking at our own reflection in the mirror of another person. Instead, we react with hostility, fear, or judgment, believing the flaw exists only outside of us. Jung warned that projection is the mechanism by which the shadow hides itself from our awareness, while simultaneously ensuring it still shapes our experience of the world. When we project, we distort reality. Instead of seeing people as they are, we see them as carriers of our own disowned qualities. This not only damages relationships, but it prevents us from ever coming to terms with our hidden self. For instance, if I am deeply insecure but refuse to admit it, I might constantly accuse others of arrogance, believing they are the problem. But in reality, the problem lies within my own unacknowledged feelings of inferiority. Projection externalizes the battle we refuse to fight within ourselves. It makes the shadow appear as an enemy in the world, so that we do not have to face it in our own heart. This is why conflict often arises not from the actual behavior of others, but from our projections onto them. People become symbols of what we reject in ourselves. Whole groups and cultures can become scapegoats for the collective shadows of societies that will not face their own flaws. History is filled with examples of this: witch hunts, persecutions, political rivalries, all fueled by the mechanism of projection. On a personal level, projection can destroy friendships, poison families, and make intimacy impossible, for we are not truly relating to others but only to the unrecognized parts of ourselves. To master the shadow, therefore, one must learn to recognize when projection is at play. The clue is often intensity. If your reaction to someone's behavior is disproportionately strong, if they trigger hatred, disgust, or even fascination beyond reason, there is a good chance your shadow is involved. The work, then, is not to change the other, but to turn inward and ask, what does this person awaken in me? What do they reflect that I refuse to see? By withdrawing projections, we reclaim the energy we had cast outward, and we begin to integrate the disowned aspects of our psyche. In this way, relationships become not battlegrounds of unconscious forces but opportunities for self-discovery. Recognizing projection as the voice of the shadow is essential if one is to take back control of the mind and stop being unknowingly ruled by what has been denied. The shadow does not only live in emotions and impulses, it also thrives in our habits of denial and repression. When a person continually suppresses feelings of anger, jealousy, or desire because they believe such emotions are shameful or unacceptable, they push those forces into the unconscious. But repression is not annihilation. What is repressed remains alive, waiting in the depths, and it often resurfaces in distorted and destructive ways. Jung observed that what we resist most strongly tends to grow more powerful, precisely because our refusal to face it leaves us unprepared for its return. This is why many individuals are blindsided by sudden eruptions of rage, compulsive behaviors, or inexplicable moods. They are encountering the shadow that has long been silenced but never truly gone. Repression creates an inner pressure that cannot remain contained forever. Imagine a river dammed up. The water does not disappear. It accumulates force until it eventually bursts through in chaos. In the psyche, this bursting can take the form of outbursts, addictions, depression, or even physical illness, for the mind and body are deeply intertwined. What a person refuses to acknowledge in the psyche often finds expression in the body. A repressed truth can haunt dreams, manifest as chronic tension, or lead to destructive choices that appear irrational to the conscious mind. Jung insisted that repression is therefore not a solution but a delay, a postponement of the inevitable confrontation with the shadow. The tragedy is that repression often comes from good intentions. We want to appear moral, kind, strong, or composed, so we bury the traits that do not fit this image. But by striving to appear flawless, we create a false self and exile the very aspects that make us whole. The shadow is not merely darkness, it carries potential. Anger, for example, when acknowledged and integrated, can become the source of courage and self-assertion. Desire, when not denied, can fuel creativity and passion. Even fear, once faced, can sharpen awareness and deepen wisdom. Repression cuts us off from these hidden resources, leaving us weaker rather than stronger. To master the mind, one must abandon the illusion that repression equals control. True control does not come from denial, but from conscious recognition. When you admit the presence of envy, resentment, or weakness within yourself, you rob it of its destructive secrecy. The shadow ceases to operate behind your back and instead stands before you, where you can engage with it. This requires honesty and humility, for it is painful to admit to qualities we have spent a lifetime disowning. Yet without this courage, we remain prisoners of an inner world that governs us without our consent. To free oneself from the tyranny of the shadow, one must stop pushing it away and instead bring it into the light of awareness, where it can be transformed rather than feared. The shadow is not merely a personal construct, it is also shaped by the collective forces of society. Each culture, family, and institution has its own unspoken rules about what is acceptable and what must be hidden. A child quickly learns which emotions and traits gain approval and which invite rejection. Perhaps anger is condemned, vulnerability mocked, or ambition labeled selfish. In response, the psyche pushes these qualities underground, into the shadow, where they remain unacknowledged yet still alive. Thus, the shadow is never only yours. It carries the weight of centuries of cultural conditioning and ancestral silence. When Jung spoke of the collective unconscious, he hinted at this vast storehouse of unclaimed human experience that flows into each individual life. This collective element is why entire groups can become possessed by shadow forces. History is filled with examples where whole societies projected their unwanted qualities onto others, blaming outsiders, minorities, or enemies for the very impulses they refused to admit within themselves. Wars, persecutions, and mass hatred are often the shadow of a people turned outward, disowned yet violently expressed. On a smaller scale, families too may scapegoat a single member, designating them as the bearer of what no one else dares to acknowledge. In truth, that individual is carrying the shadow for the whole. When you repress what society has condemned, you may believe you are being virtuous, but you are in fact aligning yourself with a mask rather than your authentic self. The danger lies in the fact that the mask is brittle, it shatters under pressure. A man who has been taught to despise weakness may overcompensate by appearing excessively strong, but eventually his unacknowledged vulnerability leaks out as cruelty, burnout, or despair. A woman who represses her assertiveness because society tells her it is unfeminine may find herself suffocating in silence, until one day her repressed fire bursts out in uncontrollable rebellion or bitterness. To master your mind, you must see clearly that the shadow you carry is not solely your fault. It is inherited, absorbed, and conditioned into you by forces far older than your own memory. But though you did not create it, you are responsible for it. Responsibility does not mean blame. It means the capacity to respond consciously rather than unconsciously. When you confront your shadow, you break a chain that stretches back generations. You refuse to pass along the unspoken rules of repression to your children, your community, your relationships. You become a site where the darkness is met with awareness rather than denial. It is only in this confrontation that you cease to be a puppet of history. The shadow that once controlled you from below becomes the teacher that grants you strength. By acknowledging the cultural forces within your psyche, you reclaim your individuality and stand apart from the mass unconscious. To master yourself is to resist being mastered by the invisible inheritance of a society that does not even know the depths of its own shadow. The shadow also reveals itself most clearly in projection. What we cannot bear to admit in ourselves, we cast onto others, often with great intensity. You may notice that the traits which most irritate or disgust you in another person are often the very ones that live unacknowledged within you. The man who despises liars may be lying to himself daily about his own motives. The woman who condemns selfishness may secretly harbor desires she has repressed so thoroughly that they now haunt her as envy and resentment. Projection is the mind's clever trick, It allows us to believe we are free of certain qualities while forcing us to wrestle with them endlessly in the outside world. Jung insisted that until you recognize your projections, you remain bound to them, living in a distorted mirror of yourself. It is as if you are constantly fighting shadows on the wall, unaware that they are cast by your own hidden figure standing behind you. This is why conflicts in relationships often repeat themselves in patterns. One lover blames the other for qualities they themselves have not owned, and the other responds in kind, until both are caught in a cycle of accusation and denial. The shadow grows stronger when ignored, feeding on blindness. But projection is not merely a personal mechanism, it has devastating collective consequences. Whole communities and nations fall into the trap of projection, seeing their rejected impulses in outsiders and enemies. Hatred, prejudice, and scapegoating are all forms of shadow projection. The group convinces itself that it is pure, righteous, and moral, while all corruption, weakness, or evil lies with the other. This delusion fuels war, oppression, and persecution. Humanity repeats this tragedy because it refuses to face what lies within. By denying the shadow, we condemn ourselves to live it out externally, often in its most destructive form. The task, therefore, is not to eliminate projection. It is to recognize it as it happens. When you feel a disproportionate anger toward someone, when you are unreasonably fascinated or repulsed by another's behavior, ask yourself, what does this say about me? What am I refusing to see in my own soul that I so eagerly chase in another? To answer this honestly requires great humility, because it strips away the comforting illusion of moral superiority. But it also grants great freedom, because the moment you take back your projection, you reclaim power over your life. To master your shadow is to withdraw these projections, one by one, until the figures you meet in the world no longer hold your disowned qualities hostage. Then, you see people as they are, rather than as distorted carriers of your inner blindness. This is one of the most difficult disciplines of the psyche, but it is also one of the most liberating. For the enemy you fought outside was never truly the enemy. It was always the face of your own shadow waiting to be acknowledged. The shadow also exerts its influence through compulsion. When repressed elements of the psyche are not brought into awareness, they do not vanish. They manifest in repetitive behaviors, addictions, and self-sabotaging patterns. These compulsions are the shadow's language, its way of declaring, I exist, and you will not ignore me. A man who represses his aggression, for example, may suddenly erupt in bursts of uncontrollable rage, shocking even himself with the violence of his outbursts. A woman who denies her sensuality may find herself lured into destructive relationships that expose her to the very desires she tried to bury. The shadow has a way of ensuring that what is pushed down eventually rises, often with greater force and in less conscious forms. Jung observed that neuroses often arise from this very struggle, the refusal to admit aspects of one's nature. The more one tries to live only by an idealized mask, the more pressure builds within the unconscious until symptoms emerge: anxiety, depression, obsessions, destructive cycles. These are not merely disorders to be suppressed. They are messages from the shadow demanding acknowledgement. The psyche will not tolerate disunity forever. It insists on wholeness, even if it must break the ego apart to achieve it. Compulsion is the soul's way of balancing what has been denied. Every extreme of repression gives rise to an equally extreme eruption. If you deny vulnerability, you may become hardened, brittle, unable to adapt, and eventually collapse under strain. If you deny anger, it will return disguised as bitterness, sarcasm, or cruelty. If you deny ambition, it may return as envy toward those who dared to live it out. Compulsions appear irrational, but they serve the rational function of bringing the neglected material of the shadow back into play. To master your shadow, you must study your compulsions not as enemies, but as teachers. Ask, why do I repeat this pattern? Why do I return to the same suffering even when I know better? The answer often lies not in weakness of will, but in the refusal to recognize what the pattern represents. That which you fight against within yourself, if left unacknowledged, will fight back until you are forced to face it. In this sense, the shadow's compulsions are paradoxical. They enslave you, but also point you toward liberation, if you are willing to read their message. Freedom does not come from suppressing these compulsions, nor from indulging them blindly. It comes from understanding them. When you bring the shadow's energy into consciousness, its destructive force transforms into creative potential. The rage that once exploded outward can become strength. The fear that paralyzed can become caution. The envy that consumed can become inspiration. What once appeared as chains reveals itself as raw energy, waiting to be integrated into the whole of your being. The final dimension of shadow work is not simply to confront or integrate, but to live with the shadow as a constant companion. The shadow does not vanish, no matter how deeply one examines it, because the unconscious is inexhaustible. Every stage of life reveals new layers of hidden material, desires, fears, impulses, that challenge the image we hold of ourselves. To master your shadow is therefore not a one-time victory, but a lifelong discipline, a dialogue with the unknown that continues until death. To pretend otherwise is to fall into arrogance, believing oneself fully enlightened while secretly remaining bound by unseen forces. Living with the shadow means cultivating humility, for you recognize that no matter how conscious you become, darkness remains. This humility prevents the ego from inflating itself into destructive illusions of purity, superiority, or perfection. It keeps you grounded in the truth that the psyche is vast and that you are never entirely in control of its depths. In this sense, the shadow keeps you human. It prevents the soul from floating away into abstraction, anchoring you in the soil of reality with all its contradictions and flaws. It also demands courage, for facing the shadow is uncomfortable and often painful. There will always be aspects of yourself you would prefer not to admit: envy, aggression, selfishness, desire. But the measure of a person is not whether these qualities exist within them, for they exist within all. The measure lies in whether they can acknowledge these forces without being enslaved by them, whether they can bear their own inner darkness without collapsing into despair or projecting it onto others. To live with the shadow is to live with constant temptation, but also with constant opportunity. Each confrontation with the unconscious holds the possibility of deeper self, knowledge, and greater strength. Mastery, then, does not mean conquest but relationship. The shadow is not an enemy to be annihilated, but a counterpart to be integrated. It is the necessary balance to the light of consciousness, the ground upon which individuality takes root. Just as the night defines the day, the shadow defines the self. Without it, life becomes shallow, sterile, a hollow performance of borrowed ideals. With it, life becomes rich, dynamic, full of tension, but also full of meaning. The one who learns to walk side by side with their shadow is not free from conflict, but free within conflict. They do not deny their inner contradictions. They embody them consciously, using them as fuel for growth rather than chains of repression. In this way, the shadow ceases to be a threat and becomes a guide, reminding you always of your unfinishedness, your incompleteness, and therefore your potential. To master your shadow is ultimately to accept that you are never finished, never perfect, always unfolding. And in that endless unfolding lies the true depth of the human soul.